Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. My name is Brooke Stedman. I'm the Deputy Director of Women in International Security. And it is with great pleasure that I chair today's panel discussion on the gender dimensions of national and international security policies. This panel will examine the importance of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, often referred to as the WPS Agenda, and focus on how gender equality advances peace, prosperity, and security. With us today, we have three distinguished panelists who I am happy to introduce. The first is Ambassador Marinaki. Ambassador Marinaki is the Principal Advisor of the European Union External Action Service on Gender and UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Prior to this, she was the Managing Director for Global and Multilateral Issues at the European External Action Service. She was responsible for EU foreign policy in the areas of international organizations, human rights, and security and non-proliferation of mass destruction weapons, a position to which she was appointed in 2011. With us also is Professor Brown. Professor Brown is teaching international affairs and political science at the George Washington University and specifically works at the Elliott School of International Affairs. He was the Dean of the Elliott School from 2005 to 2015. Also with us is Dr. Kathleen Kuehnast, who serves as the Director for Gender Strategy and Policy at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she has been since 2008. Dr. Kuehnast is a sociocultural anthropologist and has focused on the different gendered impacts of violence and conflict on both men and women. Now, we've talked a lot today about the importance of gender equality and the WPS agenda. I would like to begin today by asking my distinguished colleagues where they think the WPS agenda is progressing. Where does the WPS agenda stand today, in your opinion?
Well, thank you, Brooke, and a warm good morning to all the participants. And I would like, on behalf of the European Union, to extend our warmest thanks and congratulations for this wonderful initiative. We are grateful to Her Highness Sheikh Fatima, and we're also grateful to the great speakers of this morning, His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan and Her Excellency Rim Hashimi, and of course to Her Excellency Ambassador Lana Nuseibeh, in setting the stage for all of us. They have been pioneers, inspired leaders, and patrons that have helped the United Arab Emirates to be indeed a model case in a wider region in a very difficult subject for all of us to handle. From the side of the European Union, women, peace and security is indeed an overarching theme that we deal in a capacity of a strategic and important priority that cuts across all our initiatives. We should bear in mind the substance and the spirit of Resolution 1325, the resolution that was adopted by the Security Council of the United Nations in the year 2000, which, as a matter of fact, reminded the global community on the leadership of women as an untapped resource for peace, security, and overall development and stability. Because we are well aware, and we should never forget, that long-term injustices and inequalities that are embedded in gender relations are a long-term threat to all of our systems, and effectively we need to act in a comprehensive and cohesive way. As a matter of fact, it has been acknowledged in the retrospect that it should not be called the Women, Peace and Security Resolution, but rather the Gender, Peace and Security Resolution, because peace, security, development has to do with the whole of the society. Therefore, it's not something that should be only assigned to women. From the side of view of the European Union, we are extremely committed in making the women, peace and security aspects of our policies an integral part in our decision making. And in this context, we aim to demystify the women, peace and security overall approach in a way that should fit as a whole of government approach, both at the national as well as at the international and regional level. On this, we take very much to heart the elements that have already been prescribed by the Resolution 1325, namely the need for all countries to adopt national action plans as a helpful tool in implementing the gender-relevant policies on gender equality, women's empowerment, and the whole of this triangular gender security and peace agenda in a way that would be meaningful in the day-to-day conduct of their business and in the day-to-day adoption of their policies. And it is in this context that we have adopted our own action plan. It's not national, it is regional. It has already been adopted in the year 2008, and we're in the process now of exploring how best we should update it in order to make it up to speed with current realities on the ground. And in this context, we are working closely with the international community at the UN level, but also with other regional organizations who have a similar sensitivity in getting the women, peace and security agenda forward. And this is the case with NATO, this is the case with the African Union, and with the Organization for Security and Stability in Europe, the OSCE. So from our point of view, women, peace and security is there. We have 28 member states and therefore 28 different interpretations on how these women, peace and security should look like. So we are trying to merge different opinions that bridge from the Mediterranean to the Arctic North. All our countries are extremely committed in various degrees of relevance to their internal and national interests, priorities, and realities. But this is an area where all of us feel that there is a large room to maneuver in order to be able to come forward with policies that would reflect both the needs and the demands of the political realities on the ground.
It's very, very interesting. I know that the EU they've been staunch advocates of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. I hope maybe we can talk a little bit later about how the 28 countries will try to find commonalities between their national action plans. Professor Brown, in your opinion, as a security expert, where do you think that the WPS agenda currently stands?
Well, it's made great progress, and if you go back 25 years, it's really quite remarkable how far the WPS agenda has advanced. Of course, it was something that was just under consideration and developed in the 1990s, and it's become a reality with the passage of Resolution 1325 in the year 2000. I look at the security studies field and national security problems from a pretty traditional perspective, as many of the people in this room do. And it's important for people who do look at national security from a traditional perspective to understand how important the WPS agenda is and how important gender perspectives are in understanding the issues that we care about. And I think that understanding and that appreciation is developing as time goes by, but there's still a long way to go. I mean, if you look at the national security issues that national security policymakers care about, the central issue is the issue of war and peace, because wars are the most profound actions that nations can undertake. They pose dire threats to national security. And so the issues of conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction, the effects of armed conflict, refugees and displaced people are fundamental questions in national security. And the WPS agenda has important insights for us on all of those issues. We have to understand the gendered aspects of those issues if we're going to do a better job of conflict prevention, conflict resolution, post-conflict reconstruction, and so on. If you look at the issue of terrorism, an issue that every national security policy maker worries about to some extent or another. If you are worried about the problem of violent extremism, if you want to prevent violent extremism, if you want to counter violent extremism, you have to understand the gendered aspects of these challenges. And I think people in the traditional national security establishments are starting to get it, but there's still a very long way to go, and I think that's important. A few years ago, when ISIS declared the establishment of its caliphate in Iraq and Syria, thousands of young people from around the world went to join up. And it was really quite remarkable that ISIS had a quite sophisticated gendered approach to its recruitment and radicalization efforts. I think it caught a lot of people in the West by surprise, certainly in the United States. And here you had ISIS, which is not exactly a progressive organization, having quite a sophisticated gendered approach to reach out to young men and young women to recruit them and radicalize them to their cause. And there was a time when ISIS was actually more sophisticated in thinking about gender than a lot of national security establishments were. And that's kind of a sad commentary. I mean, if ISIS is more advanced in its thinking on gender than you are, then you're in a bad place. And I think national security establishments have been catching up, but there's still a long way to go. I mean, earlier Ambassador Nusabeh mentioned that we've seen signs of reverse progress, which is a very diplomatic way of saying that things are regressing, as Chantal de Jonge Oudraat pointed out. And I think we have to look at the progress that's been made, which is quite remarkable, but we also, I think, have to be blunt in looking at the problems that we face. And I think sometimes those of us who are champions of the WPS agenda think that if we could just get the word out there, people will see the light, they will become enlightened, and they will embrace the WPS agenda. And I think for some people the problem is a lack of information, and so yes, we do need to get the word out about why the WPS agenda is important, why it's good for national security, why it's good for international security, why it's good for prosperity and international well-being in general. But it's not just a matter of getting the word out. And I think there are two groups in particular that are problematic. The first is a group of people, mainly men, who have heard about the WPS agenda, but they just don't care. They're apathetic, they're indifferent. In some cases, they will go through the motions of paying lip service to the WPS agenda, but they don't follow through with action, with resources and action. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. They have other priorities. The second group is a group of people who've heard about the WPS agenda. They've heard about gender equality, but they are actively opposed to these ideas. And this group, mainly men, have a completely different conception of what's going on, and they're actively opposed and hostile to the idea of gender equality. And we have to recognize that there is this active opposition to it as well, and I think that's part of the challenge that we face. And one of the ways to move beyond this, as Chantal Oudraat pointed out, is to understand that this is not just a women's issue, it's a gender issue. It's an issue that affects 100% of us, and that's a way of trying to advance this agenda. But we have to do more than get the word out. We have to understand that this is also a political campaign where we face real political opposition.
Thank you, Professor Brown. I think you're certainly right that it's important to understand how gender can offer us important insights to critical issues of peace and security, certainly. Dr. Kuehnast, you work for an internationally recognized institute that seeks to mitigate conflict and help build conflict-affected societies. You've also been very involved in the development of a U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. In your opinion, where does the Women, Peace, and Security agenda stand?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Brooke, and I also want to send greetings to Her Highness Sheikha Fatima. Our institute, actually Sheikha Fatima is a household name at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. For 5 years, we have sponsored a lectureship in her name, along with the U.S. or the UAE embassy there. And so we've been well acquainted with the great progress that the UAE has made and its commitment to gender parity and gender empowerment. So I want to congratulate the organizers and also your leadership in making this event and also the progress a reality. So to your question, Brooke, well, I am not a political scientist, and you might wonder why an anthropologist is sitting up here talking about gender, peace, and security. It's a funny thing. One of the problems I see is in the way we define gender. And we like to say that gender is not another name for women. In fact, gender isn't a thing. It is really a social agreement. It is a social process that begins in our language, it gets transferred into our familial traditions, and it is embedded in our institutions. So it is no small matter to attempt to rewrite our assumptions about how human societies organize themselves to address security. And definitely the way that gendered identities have played out through the arc of human society has been very gendered. What is different is that technology has brought us into a new world in so many ways that allows a better platform for gender equality, both in terms of peace but also security. Because security is not simply about military or infrastructure. It is really about training a new generation for tolerance, for understanding. And it's not just a top-down, state-to-state diplomacy, but it is really key that it is a multi-stakeholder from the ground up. And that's why the gender, peace, and security agenda is critical, because it helps rewrite how we understand security in our society. It has as its core assumption inclusion, that inclusion can actually make us safer and provide greater human security. And so we're not just tackling an issue of women's rights, although those are critical to making this change in terms of how we understand security. But we're really trying to wrap our heads and our hearts around really reshaping how we approach our future as a human society. In terms of what that means, I think that one of the big challenges right now for this agenda is really coming to recognize where we've made progress, and we have. You know, in little over 20 years, the number of women who are in parliaments around the world have nearly doubled. We have to take each one of these different data points and see that this is a global shift in how we understand engagement and engagement toward security. In other words, it's a normalization of inclusion norm. And not only is it that normalization, but it really is the sense of trying to fit into a new world order, a world that I think our children will see us leaving this planet and creating new societies, and how indeed will we convey a form of security and inclusion in a universe outside of this planet. We have our own problems trying to make peace happen here. So my last thought for this round, anyway, is to say maybe something that's not often considered, but violent conflict is a terrible thing on our planet, but it also provides us with a unique opportunity to rewrite social norms, because we know that conflict is an interruption of the way life is. And if we can begin to look at it as an opportunity to make change in a positive, inclusive manner, I think we can move forward much more rapidly than we have in the last decade or two.
Thank you, Kathleen. You know, I think that each of you have mentioned the importance of a comprehensive, inclusive, national action plan as a means to promote women, peace, and security, or gender, peace, and security. Ambassador Marinaki, could you tell us a little bit more about the EU action plan on women, peace, and security, and how it embodies that desire to be inclusive?
Well, the action plans, as I already mentioned, should be considered as a helpful tool. They're not the solution, they're not a panacea that would solve all the problems. And they should be specifically targeted to the specific countries or regions that they aim to assist in defining gender-friendly policies, while gender should be viewed, as already indicated by my two colleagues, in a wider, far wider social context that would not be sex-defined. So in this context, the European Union has tried to embody in this action plan the elements that would be complementary to the efforts made already by the individual member states. And we are all internationally aware in the UN context that despite the fact that Resolution 1325 was adopted in the year 2000, until now, out of 193 member states of the UN, only 69 have a national action plan. So we have still a long way to go. From the side of the European Union, we are also behind in our projection of accomplishments. We still have 18 out of the 28 who do have a national action plan, but the rest do not. So in the context of including actions, what we take care is that these actions should not be seen in a separate way from the whole of the policies that the rest of the government needs to implement in any specific area. It targets across the board the whole of the government. It engages all the relevant stakeholders within the government. In order to be really practical, effective, and realistic, it should have also a budget line attached. Therefore, we should have the gender budgeting aspect included in the action plan, because otherwise it is just a wishful thinking of good intentions at the political level that do not correspond to the practical realities of financial support to these projects, and also as far as the time frame of implementation, again, should be within the realistic political life of any one government. Because it is in order to commit this government at the political level to make deliverables out of these intentions, and therefore its duration should be between 2 and 5 years if it has any prospect of being effective. And it should be comprehensive. It needs to include, and it has already been mentioned, elements that reflect current concerns, challenges, and dangers. One case in point is radicalization and violent extremism, and in their recent updates of their action plans, many of the EU member states have enhanced them to include specific actions that are targeted to combat radicalization and violent extremism. And then it could cover the whole realm of education, health, anything that has to do with the wider context of security, including the meaningful participation of women in the system of the general civil services, both in security, in civilian, and in the military context, in the judicial system, as well as, and this is extremely important, in taking up the gender parity aspects. Ambassador Nuseibeh has highlighted the importance of gender parity. She is absolutely right that this is important as a cornerstone for all our planning, and in order to have a measurable indicator of how we are progressing, but at the same time, we shouldn't confound gender parity with gender equality. There are two different aspects that need to be tackled individually on their own individual merits.
I'd like to follow up on the Ambassador's very important observation about national action plans and how there are some 69 countries among the UN member states that currently have national action plans. Some other countries are in the process of developing them. Some of the plans that exist are not all that well developed, but they exist on paper. But if you look at that in statistical terms, that means that 36% of the UN's member states have national action plans. And this is to implement a UN Security Council resolution 1325 that was passed 17 years ago. Now, there was another big initiative that was launched in the year 2000. That was the Millennium Development Goals to reduce extreme poverty and poverty around the world, embraced by every country. And it was an effort that made great progress in its first 15 years, so much so that in 2014-2015, the international community got together, the UN and the World Bank, with experts from around the world, to assess the MDGs and to relaunch that effort as the Sustainable Development Goals aimed at the year 2030. Now, the SDGs have 17 goals, 169 specific targets, and a specific target date of 2030 to further reduce global poverty. Compare that to the WPS agenda. There was a global study done of 1325 in 2014-2015 that did a very good job of looking at the track record. But there's been no similar recommitment to the WPS agenda the way we've seen to reducing global poverty. You could also compare the WPS agenda to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. You know, just 2 years ago, the Paris Climate Change Agreement was signed, and as of today, 193 of the 193 member states of the UN are parties to the Paris Agreement. And I know the Trump administration has talked about pulling out of it, but still, there is nearly 100% commitment to Paris just 2 years after the agreement was signed. And so there's a real difference between the global commitment to sustainable development and climate change on the one hand, and to the women, peace, and security agenda on the other. And if you talk to people about this, they would say, well, of course, because climate change affects every country in the world. Well, the last time I checked, there are women in every country in the world, but you don't have a comparable commitment to the WPS agenda. And again, this gets back to the point I was making before. I think the difference is that there is active resistance in many countries to the idea of advancing the WPS agenda specifically and gender equality more generally. And I think everyone in this room understands the importance of these issues. That's why you're here. The UAE has a relatively progressive view on these things. The EU does as well. This is a group of people that gets it, but the challenge is that there's an important group of people who doesn't. And that's why I think gender balancing is going to be key, because some people are not going to be convinced of this. They simply have to be neutralized in political terms. And it also brings us to the question of the next generation.
Certainly. Professor Brown, I think you touched on a very interesting point that I've heard actually in many countries throughout the world. When they're asked why they do not have a national action plan on women, peace, and security, the answer is commonly, well, we're not in conflict. We don't need this. And so I would ask you, Dr. Kuehnast, given that you work in conflict resolution, what would you say? Why do you think it's important for countries who are not in conflict to be supporters of the women, peace, and security agenda?
I want to answer that question, but I wanted to add one last thing to my two colleagues here. As we were talking about the National Action Plan, something actually kind of exciting has happened in the United States. I know there's a lot of change happening there, but back in October of this year, the Congress, the US Congress, passed a bipartisan Women, Peace, and Security Act. This is the first time that the United States certainly has applied legislation to their 2011 National Action Plan. And I think it's a game changer, because before we had an action plan, it was great. It works because it helps integrate a government around issues of security and peace building through a gendered lens. But now we have accountability. And so this kind of accountability means that actually in 1 year's time, the White House will need to report to Congress about progress that has been made in terms of women's meaningful inclusion and participation in peace and security processes, which gets to your question as to why this is so important for even those countries that are not engaged in a violent conflict on their soil, to be engaged in a Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. It's because we are all party to those peace processes. And we play an important role in helping to encourage the full inclusion approach to security, referencing now my earlier comments. We are in part needing to help provide structure, support, and guidance to encourage an inclusive approach to understanding how we move from solving human problems through the use of violence to solving human problems sitting around a table through dialogue. And so it is important that within our own governance processes that we understand and really celebrate dialogue as a process of peace development and peace treaty processes. We also know that not all decisions are made at the peace table, that the influence of international actors, international organizations, bilaterals, it is when we're all on this page of inclusion as a framework to understanding security, then we will move together faster and more deliberately, finding other tools besides violence to solve human problems.
Thank you. If I can switch lanes a little bit, but still stay on the theme of being inclusive. Professor Brown, you mentioned the fact that it's very important for security officials to understand and to support the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. I think in many countries, the security field is comprised of mostly men. And we also see the Women, Peace, and Security agenda as thought of as just a woman's issue. And I think that all of us have talked a little bit about that today, how it's really not a woman's issue. But could you just tell us a little bit further about why it's important for men to be engaged on the gender, peace, and security agenda, and how they can further advance it in partnership with women?
Well, first of all, men should be concerned about the gender, peace, and security agenda because we're all gendered people, and so we're all in this together, and that's one of the advantages of thinking about this issue in these ways. But as many of the speakers today have pointed out, these issues are tremendously important for national security, national prosperity, national power. If you care about the future of your country, you want it to be strong and safe, you want it to be prosperous. In the 21st century, a time of extraordinary technological development, moving faster with every passing decade, the key to every country is going to be taking full advantage of all of our human capacities, all of our human potential, all of our human capital. That means 100% of our people, not just 50% of our people. So even if you are a traditional national security studies person or a national security policy maker, if you care about the future of your country, if you care about the future of your country's power position in international affairs, you should care about making sure that you're taking full advantage of all the people who are in your country. So I think there are a lot of reasons why you need to be thinking about this issue in inclusive terms. In terms of the WPS agenda, though, as people here at this conference understand, there are four main pillars to the WPS agenda. The first is participation of women in peace processes. The second is protection of women in violent conflicts, prevention of violence, and relief and recovery. Now, the last three of those pillars really go together in a lot of respects because they basically are all focused on the issue of protecting women from the dangers of violent conflict and to helping them recover when those problems do occur. Chantal, Oudraat, and I have written a short paper where we refer to these three pillars as the passive pillars of the WPS agenda because they all frame women as the passive victims of violence who have to be protected. Now, these are tremendously important problems, and we do need to protect people from violence when it occurs, but it's not a coincidence that these are the pillars of the WPS agenda that are most supported by men because it reinforces traditional gender ideas about men protecting women. The other pillar, the participation of women in peace processes, that's the pillar that has made the least progress. And Chantal and I would argue that this is not a coincidence because this is the pillar that challenges traditional gendered norms. It's the pillar that calls for women to play a greater role and to have more power as peace mediators, peace negotiators, and peacemakers and peace builders. And that runs against the traditional way of doing things. And so, when you look at the WPS agenda, you see more progress in some countries than others, but also you see more progress in some aspects of the WPS agenda than others. And I think it has everything to do with gender, whether it challenges traditional gender norms or whether it reinforces them. And that brings us back to the whole issue of gender and why it's so important in looking at these issues.
Thank you. Dr. Kuehnast, did you want to add anything to that? I know that you deal a lot with engaging men in conflict-affected societies. Would you add anything to Professor Brown's remarks?
Yeah, I can add a few more remarks. We really discovered that men were key to even so much of our work on the ground in terms of conflict resolution. We did a study about 3 years ago working with Afghan and Iraqi women, and one of the takeaways from that study was we must engage men when we do women's programming. It's not as if people live in silos. And so we began to much more directly begin to develop programs that we call peaceful masculinity programming. For example, we just finished a project in Afghanistan, and it was a pilot project, but it was really looking at helping young men look at their own sense of how violence has affected their own lives. And in that way, helping them understand that is a way for them to look at a future that maybe violence isn't fused with their sense of manhood. And so one of the things is beginning to really ask, do you have to carry a gun to be a man? Can you solve problems in other ways besides through violence? And that is something that we're actively pursuing right now, is side by side with our women, peace, and security efforts. We think there also needs to be a men, peace, and security, because they're different sides of the same coin. And in that way, trying to help men look at their own identities, especially young men who have lived, if not years, decades, in a very violent society. How do we begin to reframe our understanding of solving problems at the personal level to the international level without the use of violence?
Thank you, Dr. Kuehnast. As we wrap up today's discussion, I would like to ask each of you. Oh, please, yes.
Thank you so much, and I cannot agree more with Professor Brown on effectively men and boys being disadvantaged in the way women are treated. And essentially, this attitude of having this multiple speed approach towards women and their agency to contribute at the end is a boomerang to their own effectiveness, because men and boys are also victims in the context of paying a price for policies that puts them at a disadvantaged position, and where they have to pay quite a significant price at the social and family level. Effectively, in order to be more on target in addressing the problems, we need to start thinking out of the box. We need to break the molds that have been forming our policies until now, with the stereotypes of roles and the stereotypes of definitions, and we should allow a cross-fertilization between the various silos, as indicated by Kathleen very rightly. We need to break the silos, we need to bring together the policies, and at the end of the day, we need to start at the earliest possible point. The case that we should build has to do directly with our societies, family, community, society overall, through education, in the upbringing of the children, in the upbringing and relevant re-education of the parents. Essentially, we should start at the earliest possible age, because if we are critical and honest with ourselves, we should admit that we raise our daughters differently than we do our sons. We ask our daughters, how are you going to combine career and family? We never ask our sons this kind of a question. Therefore, in order to make a new beginning and in order to pave the way and open up the horizons in this respect, we would need to rethink our overall approach and to the best possible effect to lead by example.
Thank you. I guess in wrapping up today's discussion, I think that each of you have made many important points, notably that we must think outside the box. We must have an inclusive process that engages all of society, and that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is not a woman's issue, but ultimately it's about gender equality for all. Also important that was highlighted here is that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is not something that is relevant only to conflict-affected countries, but is a global agenda that we must support. So I would like to thank you for sharing your insights today, and also thank our hosts for initiating this very important discussion. I think that highlights the UAE's dedication to gender equality and their potential to be a leader in the Gulf states. Thank you.